Kristen, since I see you, I just came from a Zoom with Joyce that you knew at Lowell.
Oh my goodness.
She
How
hasn't
did you
spoken to you
encounter
in several,
Joyce?
yeah, she hasn't spoken to you in several years, but she sends her best to you.
Oh, excellent. I was just thinking of her the other day. Thanks, Eric.
Yes,
The amazing world of Zoom cameras and
it is.
formal connections, a hallway chatter.
Yes, this is the American Council on Education is doing something similar to what you're doing. So, but she considers Kristen a dear friend. And Kristen is the president now at Potsdam, where she was the provost at UMass Lowell.
Yep.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third of the Strategic Transformation of Public Higher Education series. I'm Paul Friga. I'll be one of your hosts today. We have several others, and we're going to start with Chris Maloney of AGB, who's going to give some introductions and some official welcome.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome everybody for joining us for this third workshop in this series on strategic transformation of public higher ed. Let me make a few comments just about the structure of today's session, and then I'm going to turn things over to Paul to sort of take us away on intros for the rest of the panel here. We have three components to these workshops. The first component is a plenary session discussion and question and answer session between Paul, Friga, Scott Carlson from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and our guest panelists today from the University of New Hampshire, Jim Dean and Jamie Burnett, who you should see on your screen here. That's going to be about a 30-minute discussion session between that group. That will be recorded, so you can see we're recording the session right now. We'll record that first 30 minutes or so, and then we will turn the recording off after that concludes, and we won't record the rest of the session today. Following the plenary discussion at the front end, we'll do some breakout rooms. Everybody that is here has been pre-assigned to breakout rooms based on your institution type, institution size, and other criteria. Usually you'll have maybe 4 or 5 other people with you, and Paul will give some instructions when we get to that point on how those should flow and be facilitated. You'll have about 30 minutes of breakout room discussion to talk about today's topic with your peers. We'll come back together and we'll have a final 30-minute session or so on closing remarks, pulling content and information back out of those breakout discussion groups, report outs, and that type of stuff. And then Paul will close us out at the end of the session. So that's how things are going to be structured. If you have any difficulties, if we go to breakout rooms and you get booted out for some reason, which does happen with Zoom, just jump back on here with us and we will get you back into a breakout room. And other than that, Paul, I'm going to turn things over to you to get us started here.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see you on Hump Day on an afternoon. And the spring weather probably has you wishing you were outside instead of joining us here. But we're so excited to see many of you back for a return visit and welcome new folks to this monthly workshop series. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide okay. I assume that we're okay, great. We sent the slides in advance. If you signed up later today, we'll get them to you afterwards, but we did get them to the people who had signed up before. And the topic is about transformation. By definition, that's dramatic change in form or appearance, extreme or radical change. And I've given my own definition for the transformation program within AGB, that it's a 20% more change, typically in about a 3-year period in higher education, which is dramatic and exactly transformation. By way of introduction, I'm a clinical associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Previously, I've worked in consulting for PricewaterhouseCoopers and McKinsey, but got a PhD because of my passion for higher ed. And I also co-started, and I think Steve Beiser might be with us, a company that did benchmarking in higher ed 6 years ago that was purchased by Helio Campus, which you might have seen in the resources. They have tremendous resources and services related to academic program cost management and faculty productivity. But this is what we're talking about, big change. This, again, is a little more detailed flow for today. I'll carve out a little time to take you with some high-level macro stage setting, and then Scott and I will dig into a discussion with Jamie Burnett, trustee, I believe vice chair at University of New Hampshire main campus, and Jim Dean, president, as we dig into these and use them as our case study, which we do each time, a board member and president case study. And then we'll be followed up with your peer-to-peer conversation. We do welcome you to turn your cameras on, either during this session, but especially then, so that you can have a good, more personal conversation. and get to know each other, talk about the topic, and then we'll do some informal report outs and take some more dialogue with our guests who will be staying with us for the duration. So first, let's talk a little bit about this topic of increasing academic ROI. This slide I showed last month, but it's relevant again today as a jumping off point. I'm pretty sure all of us have seen this cliff coming, but it's an important assumption to understand that demand for seats and academic programs is projected to decline. And this is traditional enrollments. Of course, there's going to be an increase in non-traditional students, but over the next 5-10 years, we're going to see a dramatic drop. And that's on top of, you'll see in my subsequent slides, what's already some projecting to be an excess capacity situation. So we're in a declining demand and an increasing supply scenario in higher ed. And that's going to have consequences on costs in an institution, particularly of academic, which is more like 60% of the personnel costs in a university. These are some of the things from the Chronicle that universities like yourselves have been focused on pre-pandemic. So of course you were focused on growth in terms of new sources of revenue, retaining students, competing for students, graduation rates. All these made sense, expanding new offerings, and then also doing some cost management, continuing reducing costs, especially administrative costs, upgrading technology, et cetera. So these were on the radar pre-pandemic in terms of cost control. But quite honestly, there weren't significant efforts to make transformational change. Typically, this was more incremental in terms of program changes. Then the pandemic has accelerated that level of change. When Scott and I were preparing for this session, we discovered a research report that was done by EY Parthenon, and they analyzed the capacity. And I know this is a detailed chart. I had even more details in it, but I've cleaned it up a little bit. The report is worth reviewing because it takes a look at the supply over time and then what they've estimated to be excess capacity for student enrollments. And this is costly. So this is as an industry, and you can see to the left, it's public capacity, and then public 2-year has the biggest gap. That's the white space. And then the privates also have a pretty significant gap. So the bottom line here is that we may already be oversupplying available seats. And you may have felt this with competition for enrollments. And you probably have also seen these indicators with decreasing enrollments in classes on your campus over time. So if you think of that as a macro setting, and I pulled this in here, Jim, I got you in the middle, you and Jamie are kind of in this about a 13 or 14% excess capacity is what this calculation says by state, and then the core expenses to try to get some quantification. But it's 3 to 5 million excess seats that could be translating to 50 billion of essentially lost revenue because it's not properly matching supply and demand. By the way, all the way through this session, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function. And then we will take breaks halfway through, and Chris will also pepper me if he sees one that I should address. Here is another kind of interesting ROI calculator from a student perspective. If you all haven't seen this, you may want to take a look at it, especially if your university shows pretty nicely in it. It could be a nice advertising campaign, or you can share it with your boards. But this is measuring an ROI from a student perspective of lifetime earnings. And what they do is an NPV analysis of how much your graduates make when you net out the costs of the education, debt repayment, graduation rates, all these factor in. And then what they do is they actually calculate the 10-year NPV, 15, 20, 30, and 40. And I just pulled New Hampshire's data, and you can see that at the 15-year point, they're 1,000. At 20 years, they drop all the way down to 600. And this is ranked against 4,000 other institutions. So it's a real, that's a pretty positive jump in terms of telling a student that they're going to get an MPV and a payback on their investment in that institution. And then you can see 30-year down to 458 and 414. So the link is there. You're welcome to look at that. I won't go any deeper, but since we're talking about academic ROI, I think it's reasonable to think about return on investment for students. Now realize other constituents are involved. The state gives money to public higher ed, so they want an ROI. And in our first session, if you didn't see that, it's worth going back and watching Michael Crow's comments when we had our first session in March, when he was talking about the significant need to be in line with the state's priorities and objectives and be judging how well you affect the state in terms of economic development. Universities have been cutting costs. This is from a Chronicle article that I wrote last fall, and we did surveys of how you're going to handle the pandemic. The CFOs and the presidents were talking about doing cuts. You can see on the left is academic and on the right is administrative. So much more effort on administrative cuts, and I think that's probably about right. But many institutions, almost half said they're going to do some cuts in terms of academic programs. And that is a much higher percentage than if it would have been pre-pandemic in terms of making those kinds of changes. Also in that same article, I wrote an article and I put it in the readings about examining the elephant in the room is, well, how would you do a program cost review? And then these are, I'm not going to go into details about these, but you can do step by step. It really involves, I've seen some bad examples where it was pushed top down without faculty involved. That's a recipe for disaster. And also it wasn't data driven. And that's why I mentioned Helio Campus or other program providers. You can even do it yourself with a good IR group, is to start analyzing your costs per class taught, and all the faculty productivity should be a continuous improvement process. But this is a step about organizing, analyzing, and prioritizing. Also, always remember to connect to your mission. How you can increase you can start doing, looking at the net contribution of programs, but don't forget the x-axis of market demand. That's what a lot of us forget to incorporate. We keep programs around because it's hard to cut them, and faculty, of course, who teach in them don't want those programs to be cut. But to the right, you see a number of levers that you can push in terms of growing new programs, increasing teaching loads to get through tough times such as the pandemic. Another factor is faculty productivity. We might talk about that a little today. Load is a key calculator in terms of the cost, because ROI is going to be your cost compared to teach a credit hour. So if you can increase load, of course, you're decreasing the cost per credit hour taught. And then tenure versus clinical mix, as well as teaching support and release time could be millions of dollars, and we might get to that as well. So I would have loved to have spent the whole hour. Those of you who know me, I love these topics and I love thinking about and talking about them, but I think I've even gone over my allotted 10 minutes. Scott's being very patient with me. So with that, we are now going to move to our plenary session. We're very happy to have a friend and colleague of mine, Jim Dean, who I've known for a long time, previous Dean of the Business School and Provost at UNC Chapel Hill, now President of the University of New Hampshire. And then Jamie Burnett, as I mentioned, Vice Chair of the Trustees, to share their perspectives. With that, I'll hand the microphone over to Scott to start the questions.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to everyone for showing up and joining us in this conversation. It's great to have you here. So President Dean, I think I want to just open this conversation. I think we need to offer some information to the audience here about where things were for the university during COVID. What kind of adjustments did you have to make? What kind of impact did it have on the university? And where do things stand at this moment?
You're on mute, Jim.
Oh, caught me. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks, Scott, for the question. I mean, we faced pretty much the same situation that other universities did last March. We sent everyone home. We finished the semester virtually. We aspired to open up the university in the fall and the spring semester. So through the course of the summer, we had really elaborate planning that Jamie Burnett and the board was part of, to try and understand what we would need to do to be able to open up our campuses. We found ways to do that. We were open for the 12 weeks that we wanted to be open in the fall, and then went to planned online courses and exams. Then we were able to be open the entire spring. The key thing in being able to do that was we created our own testing lab, first 1, then 2, then 3. We've done over 500,000 tests of students. We tested students twice a week, faculty and staff once a week. It was expensive, but it allowed us to stay open and kept our spread down to levels that were really manageable. So we feel pretty good about how we've gotten through COVID. I think we've increased the confidence of our student body. Our enrollment's up a little bit this year, and I think maybe some of that is that people saw we were able to stay open when others couldn't.
Before we get into Paul's questions about your philosophies around this, just want to get a sense, were some programs more successful than others in terms of growing during this period, or was there more demand? And then how did COVID affect things that were sort of the auxiliary kinds of forms of income, residence halls and so on?
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about growth in such a short period of time. But I will say that health professions in general have been growing and continue to grow. We've actually, with help from Jamie and the board, we've expanded our facilities to be able to increase the size of our nursing program, for example, which is a big priority here in the state of New Hampshire. Gosh, what was the second part of that question? Oh, about auxiliaries. That's right. Yeah,
Right.
we got pounded on auxiliaries because some students decided to stay home. And when they stay home, then they don't live in the residence halls or eat in the dining halls. And that was actually a major source of lost revenue during COVID.
I see. Okay. And I mean, we can get into Paul's questions about the philosophy around this, but I'm wondering, as you headed into this period, did you think this is a big opportunity to push some changes?
Not initially. I think initially, I bet most of the people on the screen are in the same situation. We were just in survival mode, right? Are we going to be able to operate the university? It's the great unplanned experiment in online learning. It happened all over the country and it happened almost literally overnight. And so we were trying to figure out how to gear up. How can you buy 200 OWL devices to put in your classrooms? How can you get faculty trained up? So we did a lot of instant training. So we were really just trying to make it through initially. When we got to the summer, we were able to take a deep breath. And again, in consultation with the board, we were able to think about what is this going to mean for the long term? And by January, we were able to come back to our strategic plan and say, okay, it looks like we're going to make it through this year. Now, how do we want to position ourselves for the future?
Yeah, I'd like to transition to Jamie from the perspective of the board. In our pre-planning calls, you mentioned the role of the board as being setting goals, monitoring with the strategic dashboard. Didn't use that language, but I imagine you have one. When it comes to costs, I guess my research, and I presented this in our last workshop, was about 14% hits to revenue. For most institutions. That made some heavy duty cost considerations. How do you look at costs and measure revenue and costs, and what are some of the things you talk about at the board level?
Yeah, first, I would just echo quickly what Jim said. I mean, I think in the beginning of this phase, we were in survival mode, but I think there had been, not long after, a broad acknowledgement with the board and the executive leadership and the campuses of the system that we need to focus on what we can control. We can't control everything. And if we do this well, we could come out the other end of it better than maybe some of our peers. And that, I think, has been our goal. In terms of costs, I mean, Paul, I think that, it's a curse, but maybe a blessing too, that I don't think it's a secret that in New Hampshire, we're have a low level of state or public funding for our public universities. And so, we were already, I think, in a position where we were trying to control costs because we had to. There wasn't really a public funding backstop. And that's something that had been a goal. And there was a slide, I don't know if you showed it, but it's slide number 8 that really stuck out to me in your presentation. It's a graph that measures excess capacity and then also core expenses or core costs. And I don't want to suggest that in any way that the job that Jim has or the board has or our system as a whole has is easy. And there's a lot we need to manage and work through strategically in terms of our finances, but and particularly for the future. But we're in the right quadrant. We're in the correct quadrant of that, I think. I mean, we have a relatively low core cost, and our capacity isn't what a lot of our peers are. So we're possibly in a slightly better position, I think, to deal with some of these because we're kind of already used to it and we're already there. And I think that as we approach that enrollment cliff that you talked about, excess capacity is going to accelerate. I mean, it's going to be a bigger problem, and it's going to be a bigger problem quickly. But we're already putting in place big cost moves to try to lower that, and I think we were ahead of time. So it's something that we've been working on for a long time. COVID accelerated it maybe, and maybe added some different layers to things that we wanted to look at. But I think we were proactive, and it helped us out. You're on mute.
While you're on mute.
It can't, you can't have Zoom without a couple people forgetting that, but getting a little bit more specific to how you operationalize it, Jim, what's your philosophy? I know you certainly understand from all your quality management and business school background, the world of costs. Do you have a philosophy that your team takes to cost management in general, which would include across the board versus not, and how you go about bringing things? And then Scott will talk through some more details of exactly how you made change recently.
Yeah, I'm not sure I dignify what we have as a philosophy. We're certainly, I mean, as Jamie said, we're not a wealthy public university. And so it's in our DNA to be careful about costs. I would say that over the last few years in particular, we've tried to be more thoughtful, more nuanced about where we cut and where we grow, and not doing across the board costs. So you're probably going to get to this, but you know that one of our 4 strategic priorities is to build financial strength. And over the first 2.5 or so years of my term as president, it's really been about managing the expense side. And so we, with help from a couple of consulting organizations, found ways to do some pretty impressive cost cutting, not across the board, but looking at areas where our costs were higher than comparable universities. And we went in and we found important ways to cut costs. We are now approaching a point where, while we'll continue to focus on that, we're going to be focusing more on revenues as well.
Great. Jamie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just real quickly, I want to give a lot of credit to Jim and to our system leadership. There was a real proactive approach on this, and I think we know there's a problem coming. I don't think that it's really at a crisis level yet, but we know the crisis is coming, and I think that by being proactive, Jim and his team were able to be thoughtful in this, and I think we recognize that we can't just grow our way out of this problem, but in terms of trying to come up with cost reductions, being thoughtful of where we're going to do that, places where we can maximize value in certain areas, I think has been good. And so I think they've been able to do that in a pretty methodical way, a thoughtful way, without creating too many disruptions if we had waited. So
this just prompts a question for me that is a little bit off script, but I want to, I just want to ask this before we get into questions about how you controlled academic spend and got better ROI out of the academic side. But one thing I've been thinking about lately is, given what the demographic numbers are showing for the near term and long-term future, do you think, is it possible for these institutions of ours to be either static or even strategically shrinking, or is growth really just always the imperative?
Well, we certainly have de facto institutions that are shrinking. I guess you could say it's strategic. If you're thinking about what programs you save and what programs you get rid of, that's at least close to a definition of strategy. I think people are being forced into it. We are certainly aware of institutions that have needed to shrink because the demand's just not there, and growth is not realistic in certain environments. In New England, if you can, speaking about undergraduates now, and that's only part of the game, but if you're speaking about undergraduates, even if you hold your market share, you're going to be declining. So if you're going to be growing, you got to be taking share away from some other university or college. I think there was a brief moment, and some of the writers contributed to this, where we thought there's going to be so many institutions going out of business that it's going to reduce the amount of excess capacity. We're all going to benefit from it. That turned out not to be true.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, how, just go into some details about your analysis of academic spend and, how you dealt with that. Can you talk about some specific examples and talk about the approaches?
Right. So we haven't only focused on the academic spend. I know that that's where you're going to go with this, but under Build Financial Strength and looking at our so-called deep dive on costs, we looked at some academic areas, but we also looked at a lot of non-academic areas and had opportunities in each. We have now a much better idea of the cost of a course, the cost of a degree, and so on in the academic areas, and then also a better idea of what our demand is looking like. So purely on the academic side, well, I shouldn't say that. One of the things we've done is a retirement program, COVID enhanced retirement program that led to both faculty and staff leaving us. Many of them are leaving us at the end of next month. And one of the ways we're doing academic planning and managing academic spend is to very, very selectively replace people who have left and not replacing them necessarily in the same department that where they've been. So our provost and I joke about this, Wayne Jones, that it's sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity for a provost to have that kind of discretion. If, and many universities have had to do this through declaring financial exigency and cutting whole departments and all that, it's miserable. And sometimes you're forced into it. And again, I can't emphasize enough, this was done really collaboratively with the board. We had lots of meetings where Jamie and his colleagues talked with me and with the other presidents in the system about this, and came up with a way to pretty significantly reduce our costs and then thoughtfully add them back where we should.
How do you, whether it's an academic program or another program on campus, how do you assess the value of that program and what that program is bringing to the university? How do you do sort of a program review, whether it's academic or not?
Well, I mean, you'd love to be in some Aristotelian world where it's all based on some abstract concept of value. But here on the ground, it has a lot to do with students and whether students are interested in the program. I guess, to get beyond that, I mean, we do serve a market, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Faculty will make, really impassioned, and they're really good at this, arguments about the importance of their field. But at the end of the day, if people don't want to study it, what are you going to do? You can't offer classes to no students. And we had departments where the ratio of faculty to students was just not sustainable. And, what are you going to do? So you have to find ways to sort that out. Fortunately, some of that sorted itself out through the retirement program that I just talked about. You also then look at what are you good at? What are your specific strengths? And this is strategy 101. I know that, but I'll just acknowledge that. What are the things that are really important to you? So we have a world-class marine science program. We're not going to cut that. We have a wonderful program in physics and astronomy. We're one of the strongest universities in the country in terms of sustainability. You're going to build in those areas and look for ways to leverage strengths across areas. And I think that the board has been very helpful in getting us to think through that and collaborating with us on that as well.
To what extent do you need the faculty's involvement in looking at these programs and helping to make decisions about what stays and what goes?
Well, we have both the faculty senate, and we have all of our faculty are represented by a number of different unions. So if we were to try and do just cuts, we would need to have a lot of work that would be done with the union. We have a very good relationship with the faculty senate, and they've been very collaborative. The faculty senate actually were a really important part of the strategic planning team, coming up with not only the concepts, but even the language that we use to express what we're trying to accomplish, including build financial strength, which is what we're talking about now. So you can't go it alone. I think in the Chronicle and elsewhere every week you read about presidents who thought they could just act unilaterally, and it doesn't usually end well.
Yeah, that's true.
I'd like to transition now to the board board perspective. Jamie, many boards have a disconnect with the president and or the faculty, and it's often cited as a point of tension. It seems that you have some good collaborative nature here, from the way I can at least interpret the conversation between the two of you and what I hear. Could you give some thoughts as to why that's the case? How do you speak the same language? How do you work together collaboratively?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a few things. I mean, I wouldn't want to downplay this, but I think a lot of it has to do with personalities. I mean, and I think also some self-awareness and awareness coming to the job. I mean, I was one of the things I'm really fortunate to have done. I was able to serve on the search committee when we hired Jim Dean as president, and I think Jim knew coming in to the job, the environment that he was coming into with the state in terms of kind of a demanding legislature and a skeptical legislature, and a state that doesn't provide a lot of public funding, and a university that probably needed to do more in terms of demonstrating its value broadly to the state, and because I think he had that awareness, and I think we have the right mix of people involved, it's actually been pretty productive. I also think, and Jim talks about this in his book, that you want different opinions, I think, at the table, but I think you want the kind of individuals that can bring the different perspectives, but do it constructively and productively, where we can kind of take the best of all those different perspectives, but work collaboratively to put it in place. I think he talks about it in terms of differentiation and integration, but it's he's nodding. I'm getting bonus points for that. That's great. I can't give you the page number, Jim, but it's, I think that we have just the right mix of people on there. And I think as a board, we work really hard at taking our own inventory and figuring out, who are trustees that will bring, the right experience, but also I think the right attitude to the role. But one thing I wanted to touch on too, Paul, before, just in terms of, Jim laid out, I think, sort of an academic, slightly kind of like an internal academic assessment that you would do in terms of trying to figure out where you have programs that are valued. But I think that Jim has, and I think the board has contributed to this too, also looked externally, and I touched on it before, like how can we cement our relationship in the state? And Jim actually, in his strategic plan that he laid out really early on when he became president, talked about, so I forget, Jim, exactly the pillar, how you named it, but like what UNH's role is in terms of New Hampshire. And I think that we have, collectively with the president, the provost, and the board, have tried to figure out, okay, where can UNH specifically in this case add value in terms of New Hampshire's workforce, in terms of what any other needs that we can provide. And so Jim talked about oceanography and aerospace and astronomy and engineering, and those are all important. But one thing he left out, but they've done really well on, is recognizing that there's a growing demand in terms of health sciences, biosciences, biotech in the state, and they have put together great strategic moves with the support of the board to enhance those areas. And some of that has been capital investment and trying to make sure that we have the facilities to provide those programs. Some of them have been really specific initiatives in terms, he touched on maybe in our breakout session earlier on like nursing, that there's a huge demand for nursing. And so we saw something a year and a half ago in our last budget biennium that you never see in New Hampshire, and that is that the legislature and the governor said, we're going to give you more money than we've been giving you, because we believe in your ability to do this, and we want to help you grow your capacity to produce more nurses for this demand in our workforce. And I think that some of that credit, I think, is just on kind of the political leadership that Jim and his team have shown, and along with the board, but also I think the fact that they were strategically positioned, like they were already postured to be able to do that and take advantage of it when the opportunity was there. And so I think, that's something he gets a lot of credit for, and I think that's something the board's worked really hard on in supporting. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I just want to jump in and ask a question of both Jamie and Jim. It's sort of a two-part question. One is, Jim, ahead of this, we talked a little bit about business speak and academic speak, and the role of business speak on campus, and how words like right sizing or disruption or creative destruction can be difficult words to utter on a campus. How do you translate some of this kind of business orientation for an academic audience? And then the side of that question for Jamie is, there are these difficult conversations that you need to have on campus, and ways that the administration has to shift a college or university in a certain direction, maybe a more business or financially minded direction. Does the board have to be a backstop for the administration in those cases? And how do you see that role? And the two of you can answer that question in whatever order you want.
Jim, you mind if I just take that part first? Because you probably have a much longer and better answer for it. But I think that when we're going through these maneuvers with financial restructure, positioning for the future and all the challenges, I said in our breakout session earlier that our job is to try to think macro, think strategically for the system, set some goals along with our executive leaders like Jim, and then let the managers manage to those goals. And we hold them accountable and we try to stay on that path, but let them manage. So while we may have a tendency at times to get into the weeds on this, I think that's our role. But the other part of that, Scott, that you touched on is that once we set those goals, once we say, Jim, we need you to find this amount of cost reductions, we want to put a priority on whatever, adding value in this area, but then we have to have their back. And I think that speaking for me, but I think our whole board would largely agree with this, is that I try to remind myself that of what I don't know, and there's a lot that I don't know, and so we try to stay strategic, set the goals, let Jim work towards those goals, and make sure we have his back. So when he's doing the really hard work with his faculty and his staff, he knows that he's got some cover and support because he's doing what we asked him to do.
Right, and I really appreciate that, Jamie. Very, very helpful. It's been a great relationship. On the faculty side, in terms of business speak, faculty are smart people. They understand a lot. They haven't spent a lot of time in business, so the language often is foreign to them. And I think there's a little bit of a reaction to the language because I think they believe that it has to do with values that they don't necessarily subscribe to. And so one of the brickbats that get thrown at university leaders is corporatization, which is some combination of talking like a business person or acting like a business person. Jamie, I think, mentioned my book before. Part of my book is to say what about business is useful in running a university and what is less useful. And, it's beyond obvious that you have to find a way to generate enough revenue to support your costs. And if you're not, then you got to do something about that. All faculty can understand that. I try, however, to stay away from, the buzzwords. I just saw a survey recently that even business people hate most business buzzwords, let alone people in academics. So why do it? I mean, you don't need to. Sometimes it's a substitute for thinking, to just use the fancy terminology. Our costs are too high. We need to reduce our costs. There you go.
Well, that's getting close to a great way to conclude. As a quote, we've addressed like a lot of the things I've talked about in the macro session, and then we got your specific case examples of how you made these things happen. There are lots of different folks from different types of institutions here, community colleges as well. I know we've said a lot of kind of advice about how to approach getting your control over academic spend. And I've heard stories of faculty who have the instant response, oh, that's our core mission, we can't cut there. So just kind of wrap up both of you with when you think about increasing your return and the returns, we haven't talked much about measuring the returns, whether it's from a student perspective. We did talk about the state makes investments in you. So figuring out how to anchor in what they're after is also a good strategy. But obviously controlling your costs will increase ROI depending, if you just kept the outcomes the same. So last piece of advice for folks venturing into, which is often a taboo subject on their campus.
Paul, I'm not sure I caught the thrust of the question. So can you say it again, please?
Essentially just a last tip of advice for someone who has to make changes in maybe a more hostile organization or, when there's immediate resistance.
And it's just like change management anywhere else. You've got constituencies and they're important to making the changes. You have to find a way to get as many people under the tent as possible. The challenge in higher ed is that the clock speed is very slow. People will think for a long time about doing things, and I'm not sure we have that luxury now. And I think that's actually going to put a big strain on our shared governance model. But again, I said this earlier, people have tried to just skip it and just make unilateral changes. And I don't think that works. I mean, what you need to do is invest in those relationships before the crisis hits.
And Jamie, I just made you spotlight for the last word.
Yeah, I think so. I was trying to figure out what was happening on the screen. You know, I don't know that there's a silver bullet for it, Paul and Scott, but you know, there's a thing I say a lot in politics, which is a little bit my background, is that, you know, in politics, you need to be honest and direct, but also kind, you know? And so I think that, you know, being honest in your communications, being transparent in your communications, being compassionate at the same time, I think is really helpful. You know, empathetic for the people that are, you know, that are in these positions and are in these roles. You know, that's, I think, what we need to be as a board, but, you know, also I think probably what Jim and his leadership team needs to be in terms of implementing some of the strategies and the things. The other thing I would say quickly is that it's another political thing, but, you know, in terms of the, you know, the honesty, there's a quote that I think largely has been attributed to George Romney when he was the president of American Motors Company, that corporation rather, that there's nothing so vulnerable as entrenched success. And I thought about that last night when I was preparing for this, because you know, he was talking about it in terms of the car industry, I think in the 60s, and you know, higher ed, I think is kind of has to think along those lines right now, that, you know, we have a really changing market. We need to be honest about that with ourselves, from board all the way down to faculty and staff. And there's nothing so vulnerable as entrenched success, you know, so we need to change if we're going to sustain what we do and do it well. And, you know, I think probably even American Motors figured that out, because I don't think any of us are driving a 2020 Pacer right now. So they did well initially, and then not so well. So, but just honesty and compassion, I think, is probably the best approach in this.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you, Scott, for the intriguing interview. And just a few comments on the chats that I saw in there. Chris did share the link to Jim's book, which is really a must-have for any board members here, and probably any presidents to give to their board members, about how to work together and understand the unique culture of academics, but put it in common language. And then someone asked about the session videos. Chris, maybe we can give a link to where people can see the past. We do take these plenary sessions and we share those. So we'll make those available on chat. Now we'll stop the recording, and then we'll move to the next phase of